Bet the Board presents Stay Green. Stay Green is your first stop for all the metrics, matchups, and money-making opportunities at the track each race week. This is Stay Green, the NASCAR betting podcast. Here are your hosts, Todd Fuhrman and racing analyst Chris Werme.
Welcome into the Stay Green podcast, part of the Bet the Board podcast network. Busy show on tap for all of you loyal listeners today. A quick recap, or maybe not so quick, of what we saw unfold at the Coke 600. An adult shedding tears in the wee hours on the East Coast because Kyle Larson isn't able to complete 1,100 miles, and plenty of other things to pay attention to when we look towards Gateway this weekend. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by Kyle Larson apologist and enthusiast Chris Werme. And Wormser, I mean, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being as devastated as one individual could be, how crestfallen were you watching the anticlimactic events of Sunday unfold before your very eyes?
Yeah, kind of a bummer. I wanted everything to kind of go off without a hitch, just because it's such a weekend I look forward to so much. Even though, I mean, what a letdown the Monaco Grand Prix was. And then to have a delay in the Indy 500, which overlaps into the Coke 600. I just had sensory overload. I'm trying to live bet both races, missing stuff. I don't know what strategy guys are on. Couldn't have been worse over here. I was happy to kind of escape with a fairly even weekend after everything was all said and done. But it was a lot of work for below minimum wage, that's for sure. When you put in all the hours between all the practices of IndyCar leading up and Friday, Saturday, Sunday, definitely below minimum wage for my return this week. That's for sure.
Definitely not worth the month of buildup for the Indy 500 to see the favorite Joseph Newgarden, and who went out there and flat out took it from Pato O'Ward on the final lap, deserved to win the Indy 500 for the second time in as many years. Unfortunately, to our chagrin, Alexander Rossi wasn't able to find a little bit of jet fuel over the final 10 laps and drink the milk for the second time in his illustrious career. But a lot of things to cover. And for those folks who are tuning into the Stay Green podcast for the very first time, we break things up. Stage 1, all about what we saw and learned from the previous week. Stage 2, a race preview. This week will take us to Madison, Illinois at Gateway. And Stage 3, a question that I have for Werme and a valuable learning experience for us, even after doing this for as long as we had, in terms of building our cards and where things have gone right, and more importantly, where things went wrong last weekend. But, you know, when we look at Stage 1, Werme, I mean, we can rehash the Coke 600, but I'm not sure there were a lot of takeaways for a race that was shortened by an entire stage. Drivers on different strategies, trying to figure out if they were racing to the rain and how differently they might have approached. Credit to you. You said you weren't going to fade Brad Keselowski in a race of that length. And who knows if that thing stays green and goes the distance. Brad arguably had one of the best cars that was out there. But Christopher Bell gets to victory lane. I mean, he was one of the best cars in terms of staying at the front and keeping it there. And we'll have plenty of other 1.5 miles to dissect. But the big news of the week, and I want to look at it through a gambling lens, was, of course, the announcement that came down with one of the 4 car teams, Stewart-Haas Racing, announcing that they are going to be selling off their charter and folding up operations at the culmination of 2024. It was only a few years ago where Kevin Harvick was kind of the gold standard in this sport.
Yep.
And I mean, he encapsulated it perfect. I mean, he said it's amazing in 6 months, you go from forever to the next 4 driver in Josh Berry to for sale, which is what we're seeing here. But how do we approach a scenario like this with the SHR drivers, knowing that they're not going to get the same manufacturer support? And quite frankly, who knows what life will be like around the shop? They're racing for their next contract, but the team clearly looking to sell off all of its pieces for spare parts.
Yeah, I think we all saw this coming, but to actually kind of see it happen at this point in the season, it certainly, I guess not. I don't want to say it's shocking. I think just the fact that Stewart-Haas isn't going to be in the sport anymore, I guess as a whole, is shocking, but maybe not if you've been close to it. There's been some grumblings here for a while, especially when I guarantee you that 23XI is looking for charters. I know that Dale Earnhardt, there's been some discussions there. So I guess not shocking, but then again, you got to feel for the drivers, and we have to look at this through a betting perspective. We could sit here all day and discuss where drivers might end up or what might happen, but ultimately, if you can't bet on it, then there's no reason for us to talk about it.
100% agree.
Where it does matter is where are these teams at? Because they are teams. It's not just a driver. I can tell you that the driver is going to go out there and try to get the best finish possible, but what does it look like in the shop? If you walk into a company and say, hey, we're going to fold up shop in 8 months, I can't imagine everyone's going to, oh man, I can't wait to take the next 8 months of my life and put everything, pour my heart and soul into this thing that's no longer going to exist. And I think that's where you just kind of have to, from a betting perspective, take a step back and maybe not have an opinion right away. See what happens when these cars unload. Now, am I saying that they're giving up? No, but it's hard to win NASCAR races when you're fully funded and you have the best guys on pit road and you have the best mechanics in the shop and you have the best engineers calling these races. All of a sudden, it only takes one or two mistakes by someone that just is kind of mentally checked out for you to struggle, whether it's on pit road, whether it's with adjustments, whether it's just with strategy in general. I think, we saw it a little bit last year with Legacy when they switched from Chevy to Toyota, and that became a deal where all of a sudden it looked like Eric Jones and Noah Gragson were driving tricycles out there that were so slow. So I wonder just where these relationships kind of where they end up or where they go these next few weeks. Certainly be interested just to see and not have an opinion either way. Maybe we're going to be looking to fade these Stewart-Haas cars, or maybe we're going to find some value. Either way, anytime there's a change like this, especially a massive one like this, the goal is to try to see around the corner and, hey, how can we make money off of it? I know that it's not a great deal for SHR and all the people there, but as bettors, we have to look at, hey, how can we make money, whether it's betting on or against them? And maybe there will be something that shows itself. But as of right now, just kind of wait and see what happens.
And I think that's the kind of prudent approach. You don't want to make blanket generalizations. You don't want to paint yourself into a corner and be able to put yourself in an optimal position when you look at how they unload each and every week. And to your point, if they're unloading fast, are they continuing to race fast? Are they making some ill-timed miscues? And I have to wonder around the shop how ironclad some of those non-competes actually are. As some of the folks will look for jobs with other racing teams trying to beef up with good personnel. But felt that was relevant. Through a gambling lens, not a team that we thought was going to compete for a championship this year, but some very talented drivers that had shown progress, especially at mile and a halves, most notably Noah Gragson. And as we go to some of these shorter tracks later in the season, typically where Josh Berry and Chase Briscoe do some of their best work. Ryan Preece, unfortunately, for me, probably becomes the odd man out, and I can't really see him in 2025 and beyond in a high-end cup ride, but we will see how all of that stuff takes place in silly season. So
I'll say this. I think that if someone wins, I think that there will be a race where Noah Gragson or most likely Josh Berry is competing for a win. I do think that we could see that out of that team. So, but a bummer for everybody. It's interesting to see where these drivers are going to go. This is where the silly season is going to get crazy. I don't have any inside information on that stuff, mainly because you can't bet on it. But I do think that Josh Berry, I think, has the best chance at winning. He showed some good speed last week. He's gotten much better. I think he's finally comfortable in this cup car coming from the Xfinity series, where I thought he was a very solid driver. I would not put it past Rodney Childers to get that 4-car into victory lane at some point this season.
I mean, for all intents and purposes, when you look at Josh Berry, still doesn't even have 30 starts at the cup level. Yeah. So he's a guy that continues to learn on the fly, and you wonder how this potentially stunts his growth. The one thing that you mentioned, if Dale Jr. does find a way to get a charter, have to think, given the relationships there, that Josh Berry would be at the top of his wish list to try and take over cup responsibilities there. But we'll wave the green, white checkered flag and put a bow on stage one. You can follow Chris on social media at Chris Werme15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there, most importantly, for all things Bet the Board, including our college football preview series that's officially underway with Conference USA and the MAC kicking things off with Brad Powers. Follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Werme, as we go to stage 2, which is all about Gateway this weekend, and we look at some of the track specs, we'll head to Madison, Illinois, just outside of St. Louis, and an asphalt racing surface, 1.25 mile track. It's a flat, short track is how the drivers describe it, with an interesting caveat that we use the intermediate racing package. So keep that in mind when we're looking at horsepower, downforce, and such. No banking in any of the turns higher than 11 degrees. Turns 1 and 2, similar characteristics to New Hampshire Motor Speedway, with turns 3 and 4, very similar to Phoenix. The track's egg shape mimics that of the legendary Darlington Raceway. As far as track comps, fair or foul to use Phoenix and New Hampshire as potential litmus tests for what we may see unfold this weekend at Gateway.
Yes, from a tire perspective, but no from an aero package perspective. So it's, I don't know. I would say kind of neither, but also both of them. I don't know. How's that for? Is that good
Very
podcasting?
helpful. Very helpful.
Yeah,
Saying
hey,
a lot,
I'm here
just
for you
saying
guys.
nothing, Worm.
Yeah, I know. Can I just say pass? Like, I like to pass on this. Here's what I will say.
Well, if we
I
do
will
see
say-
passing, that would be great on a short track. So maybe
Oh.
we figured something out with the intermediate package. If we get passing this weekend, that NASCAR's problems will officially be solved. I'm not going to remain that optimistic, but look, you can have some wishful thinking from time to time.
Yeah, I'm looking at last year's race and then at 2022. I think that those are the best barometers. Is just go directly to the track. I think if it'd be kind of a fool's errand to look at Phoenix or to look at Loudon and say, well, or give an explanation as to why you like or don't like a bet based on those two tracks. I think you just have to go to this track. There is a very little passing here. The only thing that might have been more boring than the race was handicap, like rewatching it, knowing what was going to happen. You saw the same few guys out front all week or all weekend. Here's what I will say. You're going to see 2 tires, 4 tires, and once they're on pit road and once they can make it to the end on fuel, I don't think you'll see 4 tires. I think you'll have to take 2 tires to keep it up there. We saw Michael McDowell 3 pit stops in a row take just right side tires. Very strategy laden race. You have to be on the right strategy. I don't care how fast your car is. If you're not on the right strategy, it's almost impossible to win this race. Last year, we saw 5 restarts in the final 40 laps. You better be good on the short run. I think that it's if you're good on the short run, you can pick up 4 or 5 spots, maybe on a restart. But if you're good on the long run, as strung out as this track gets, I think you only pick up 1 or 2 spots. So if I were a Cup team and a crew chief, which I'm not, I would absolutely be working on the short run. I think that you have to qualify well. You will not see someone from outside of 20th be able to just drive through the field. They can perhaps get to the front with some sort of strategy call, whether it's a 2-tire or they just stay out and then get that timely caution where everyone pits and they've kind of inherited the track position. That's a thing. So it is, there are some angles you can take when handicapping this race, but it's not one of those where, like last week at Charlotte, I thought that Chris Buescher starting last was one of the best cars. I mean, he started last and still had 17 fast laps. That's in traffic. That was issues on pit road. I don't think you see anyone starting 30th is just going to be able to work their way through the field. It is just so hard to pass. 1.5 grooves all the way around. So even though there's not a track comparison, it's so different that I just kind of wanted to unpack everything that I've kind of made note of before we start to handicap some of these drivers.
And this track's still very much in its infancy as far as Cup drivers are concerned.
Yeah.
It's only the 3rd time we're there. Both races, though, came during the next gen era, and so you do have some outlier data points. So it's tough to look at average finish, driver rating and all that and make blanket generalization in terms of how some of these drivers will perform. But when we look at individual drivers, and what we've done all season long is kind of divide them into different tiers. I think tier 1 and tier 2 most likely will be where your winner comes from, barring a potential long shot that we can get to a little bit later in the show. But when we look at tier 1, I mean, it's rinse and repeat more or less every week. Denny Hamlin and Kyle Larson, the shortest shots on the board, but William and Byron and Martin Truex have kind of bridged that gap a little bit. And the one thing I'll say, to be overly critical and probably not fairly for the 5 car of Kyle Larson, if we try and find a track type that isn't necessarily in his wheelhouse, and this is, of course, a leap of faith, short, flat tracks have not necessarily been his bread and butter, the same as high tire wear, 1.5 mile tracks. So when you go through this quartet of drivers, can we see prices on some of these guys shortening? Is there a guy that you think is worth getting on early? I mean, because this more or less falls right into the Denny Hamlin. Check that box for a short flat track, knowing how good he's been at 1.5 miles with that, the particular engine and downforce package we'll see this weekend.
Yeah, I think you have to give Denny Hamlin the edge over Kyle Larson this week. Just short, flat track. Larson, this was one of the few places he struggled last year. Struggled qualifying, struggled early in the race as well. Did have to make a few strategy calls to get himself up there on that front row for a final restart, which is just kind of what great teams do. And I kind of anticipate, I think Larson will find himself, I think he'll qualify better. I think he qualified like back in 22nd or at least outside the top 18, was able to kind of work his way through the field, but he was really the only guy that was able to do it. Denny Hamlin in practice last year looked unbeatable. But then again, if he didn't get, I don't think he led very many laps at all, if any at all. And so someone that was that dominant in practice, I know he was in Group A, which was way faster than Group B, but he looked that good and wasn't able to get the lead, wasn't able to wrestle the lead away from Kyle Busch at all. So, man, I think these short prices, I don't like short prices this week because it's so hard to pass. If someone does steal track position and finds themselves on the front row, it could be anyone from, Chris Bell to even, we'll say Michael McDowell. Those guys are going to be really hard to pass, even though they didn't show the same kind of speed or haven't shown the same speed throughout the season. These cars are very aero sensitive and they'll be able to aero block. You're doing a ton of shifting. And because you're able to shift, whenever you get loose, you're able to drop a gear and get back to the gas really quickly. That's what makes it so hard to pass in the corner. So I don't like short prices this week going in. Now, if we look at practice and qualifying and someone does look significantly better than anyone else, we're not afraid to back Denny Hamlin and Kyle Larson at short prices, but not one of Larson's best tracks. If I had to circle one where Larson's probably not super excited to come race, I would say that this has to be one of them.
You also wonder, too, and we don't talk about it all the time in motorsports the same way we do in stick and ball sports, if this weekend's a letdown. And I'm not going to accuse Kyle Larson of not being focused, but you wonder if there's that level of exhaustion and the frustration. I mean, he looked like a beaten man with his head down, knowing that he couldn't get into the car to race at all in the Coke 600. Yeah. Have to imagine he was a little bit disappointed with that late speeding penalty at Indy. So we'll see exactly how the 5 unloads and how things look there. So we can move right through tier 1 and blow into tier 2, maybe where there's a little bit of opportunity and upside. And when we look at some of these guys, widely priced from as low as 8-1, but I'll call them more or less 10-1. Shop around. There's no reason to take any of these guys at a price less than 10-1. Upwards of 18-ish, and that includes the likes of Ryan Blaney, Christopher Bell, last week's winner, Tyler Reddick, who raced from damn near worst to first, despite being a lap down when the green flag dropped at Charlotte, Chase Elliott, Ty Gibbs, Brad Kay, Kyle Busch, and Joey Logano. And we can almost go back to front because when we look at the 2 trips that we've made to Gateway in the past, Worm, I mean, this has been the Kyle Busch and the Joey Logano show. These 2 cars have been outstanding at Gateway. And while Logano hasn't been great this year in a lot of points-paying races, if we look back to the most recent short track, Logano pulled it. Logano started the race on the pole and never looked back at North Wilkesboro. So when we look at Joey Logano, 18-1, Kyle Busch, a similar price, either of those guys mildly intriguing for you this coming Sunday.
This is a NASCAR betting podcast, and we're talking about Kyle Busch and Joey Logano. It sounds just like nails on a chalkboard.
I mean, this feels like it's a turn back the clock podcast. Turn back the clock to 2022 and previously.
Oh my gosh. Here's the thing. Joey's been bet down. I think his best price, I'm not quite sure. We've noticed, by the way, we've noticed that some books have different prices in different states. So when we are saying that a price, that's because the state or the province where we're in, the price is one, and we notice in other states or provinces it's a different price. I do think that Logano's been bet down. Well, here's the thing: if Logano had been qualifying better, I could see backing him, and there's still a part of me that wants to back him because they're kind of the 2 best. Their average finishes for Kyle Busch is 1.5 on the 2 races here, and Joey Logano's is 2.0, and they've just raced each other kind of for the wins. Now, the one thing that's similar in both of these races is there were many cautions at the end of the race, and they were able to make it stick when other drivers weren't able to do that. But it was a 2-tire strategy or 4-tire strategy that eventually got them to the front.
I mean, look, Logano used a 2-tire strategy at, where was it? It wasn't Richmond, it was Martinsville, where he basically made 2 tires hang on
and he made it work.
Part of the
80 laps.
Nothing fell off.
80 laps he made it. That's a good point. This is one of those races, and we've talked about this. It's kind of haunted us, I guess, throughout the last couple years in this package, in this car specifically, is trying to fade a bad driver. And Denny even talked about this on his podcast. When you are in running 20th, and let's just say you're a guy that typically runs in the top 10, and you're running 20th, just do what everyone else isn't doing. If everyone's staying out, you pit, you take your tires and hope that you get a long green flag run and you're able to get that track position. If everyone pits, you stay out and hope that you can just kind of hang on. This is one of those tracks where that can happen. Yep. You could find yourself with Daniel Suarez taking 2 tires or staying out. And Daniel Suarez has been pretty damn good at this track. It's so hard to pass that whoever gets the lead has just a massive advantage. If you have even if it's a 4 or 5/10 of a second lead, I'm not saying that that's not, you can't overcome that. That's not what I'm saying. But it's going to take 15, 20, or 30 laps in order to work that driver over in order to make the pass. So it will take, in my opinion, it will take Joey Logano, who's struggled in qualifying. It will take Logano a little bit more work than it will take Kyle Busch, only because I think Kyle Busch has just found a little bit more speed lately. I think it was last week at Charlotte. He was your pick to win based on practice. And he had that issue early on. But he worked his way back up to, he was kind of in that top 10 area.
He didn't at least implode, which is a step in the right direction for the 8
For him, that's massive, because usually when he makes a mistake, you might as well just get his bus fired up because he's leaving early. Like, he ain't even staying for the whole race. So this is one of those races where I do like both of those guys. I would say I'd have to lean more Kyle Busch than Joey Logano. However, when you look at the speed that the Fords have had, it's easy to jump on that Logano train and say, well, he's a Ford. Look at Brad K last week. Look at Brad K the last few weeks, and same with Chris Buescher, and say, well, the Fords clearly have found something, but it hasn't quite hit this 22 team, and it hasn't quite hit the 12 team as much as it's hit RFK or even the 34 and the 38 with Gilliland and McDowell. So, man, here I am. I feel like I'm talking in circles now, but that's just quite the conundrum with liking Kyle Busch and Joey Logano going into a weekend when you just haven't seen the finishes out of either one of those teams.
We'll sit here on Sunday and go, you know what? We probably shouldn't have taken 18-1 pre-week when we can get 30-1 on race day.
Yeah, exactly.
To round out our portfolio. But when you look elsewhere at some of the other tier 2 drivers, I mean, Tyler Reddick used to be a guy that you could try and fade on short flat tracks. I feel like he's come into his own there, that it's no longer the case, getting significantly better at this particular discipline. Chris Bell, we've talked about. And you mentioned Ryan Blaney. I mean, flat tire, ended his day prematurely at Charlotte. Best finish is 7th over the last 6 races, so current form isn't there, but did lead 47 laps at Dover. I know Dover, not quite apples to apples, concrete versus asphalt, but maybe a little bit of similarity. And when you talk about this particular, short flat track, I mean, Ryan Blaney performed extremely well here at Gateway. 4th and 22, 6th last year, a driver rating of 120, led 95 combined laps. So Ryan Blaney's a guy at 10-1 that's mildly intriguing for me.
Yeah, and I know some sharp groups like Highline Betting has moved on him. I think that Blaney's a guy that has shown, obviously, in Penske, he's been the fastest guy. He's shown his ability to qualify well and run solid races. We just haven't seen that race speed. Remember last year, he did show it last year at Gateway, but he was also coming off a phenomenal run at Charlotte, which it's almost like he was shot out of a cannon. I think when it comes to some of these other guys, you have to look at, how has Tyler Reddick qualified here? And it's been pretty darn good. He's qualified 4th and 9th. So you take a look at that. I do think it's really important you qualify well, but if you look at his finishes, he's had some issues. He finished 16th and then 35th last year when he blew a rotor, which was a common thing. And that just goes to show you how hard these guys are on the brakes going into 1 and going into 3. So, man, you have to qualify well, and I do trust Tyler Reddick to qualify, so I just don't like his price. I think anyone under 15-1 right now is a really tough bet, just because if you qualify 20th, you're going to see a a price that's much cheaper than you'd have to pay right now. So, gosh, I'm not a Reddick guy. This just isn't my favorite racetrack at all. Now, Chris Bell,
have to learn to love it, Worm. Learn to love Gateway.
Here's my thought on Chris Bell. In 2022, I faded him across the board. And then in 2023, he was the best outright price, I thought, on the board. Like, those are the notes I have. So I've completely flipped the script on Chris Bell, going from a guy you'd fade in 2022 after practice and qualifying to, in my opinion, the best outright on the board in 2023. So I hope that's helping everybody at home. But it also goes to show you change your mind. But those three guys, when it comes to Bell, Reddick, and Blaney, I think you have to say Blaney would be the best, has the best, the most upside, just because he's qualified so well. And short flat, he's been phenomenal at Phoenix in the past, and ran well here last year.
One other driver I want to ask you about real quick. I mean, we talked a little bit about Brad and his current form that speaks for itself. I mean, quietly, this guy is racking up podium finishes like they're going out of style despite not leading laps. But his teammate Chris Buescher, we talked about the heartbreak and how close he's been to winning not one, but potentially two races. But the end result is just one top 10 over his last 7 races. And as far as the one trip he made here next gen wise, started deeper in the field, finished 12th. But when I think about short flat tracks, I mean, the 17 isn't a car that comes to front of mind.
Yeah, he ran well last fall at Richmond. I think he had a chance to win that race. But gosh, it's really hard to compare Richmond. At least there's tire fall off at Richmond. You don't see a lot of 2 tire stops at Richmond. You don't see a lot of guys staying out at Richmond. So this is a little bit different animal in that respect. Man, one top 7 finish in the last, how many races you were saying?
One top 7 for Chris Buescher over his last 10 races. And let me make sure I'm pulling up the data and looking at it correctly. So here, 23rd at Charlotte, 30th at Darlington, 2nd at Kansas, where he gets nosed out, 17th at Dover, 25th at Dega, 15th at Texas, 15th at Martinsville. I mean, that's really about it.
That is, it
one
is
top
shocking.
10 last 7 races.
I would put him as, right now, I think, if you just look at NASCAR as a whole, if you're just taking like a macro look at this sport, you have to say Hamlin and Larson are kind of consistently the fastest, maybe with outside Tyler Reddick. But you have to put RFK right there in the top 5 fastest cars week in and week out. Now,
I mean, look, Brad's got 5 top 3s so far this season. I mean, that's better than Denny Hamlin, and it's tied with Kyle Larson and tied with William Byron.
Chris Bell did not want this. Now, yes, he was leading the race, so of course he wants rain. But he said, he's like, the 6 is faster than me. You know, the 6 was not when Chris Bell would get to the lead. The 6 was right there, just couldn't figure out a way to pass. And I heard when I was listening to the radio of Brad Keselowski, and this is back at Charlotte last week for the 600, he's like, I just need this thing to stay green for longer than 25 laps and I'll blow by him. You know, my car is so good on the long run. However, when they haven't qualified well at places like Charlotte, which obviously Buescher to a backup started last, and then Brad starting deep in the field, you're not going to be able to do that at Gateway. The only way you're able to do that is if you get off sequence, you take 2 tires or you stay out. You're not going to be able to drive through the field. These guys were able to drive through the field last week. So I'm hoping RFK, if they're going to be competitive this week, they better figure their shit out when it comes to qualifying. Because if you think that starting 26th or 27th is hard at Charlotte and working your way up through the field, you got yourself a whole nother animal here at Gateway, because it is almost impossible.
I'll go the exact opposite. Honestly, when it comes to Brad, I hope he qualifies like a donkey. His outright price drifts to 30, and then you at least have a guy that you feel comfortable that's going to take 2 tires at some point and do something to try and flip the field. I wouldn't try and bet him in matchups by any stretch of the imagination if that was the case, but I wouldn't be afraid to fire a small long shot bullet on him coming up through the field, not because he's passing cars, but because he's thinking outside the box
and he
doing
can
things that are a little bit different.
And is there a guy you'd rather have on 2 tires that you need? I think that you look at a guy like even a guy like Joey Logano or Brad Keselowski, if you say, hey, we're going to give you track position, but you're going to be at a tire disadvantage, I trust those guys as much as anybody to keep it up there. You could probably throw Larson in, or not Larson. I would throw Hamlin in there. I wouldn't throw Larson in there. I would throw these guys that tend to make their car seem really wide and really hard to pass, and that's Brad Keselowski. So I guarantee you there will be some sort of audible that they could call if everyone's pitting and they want to stay out. Paul Wolf is the opposite of an idiot up there on the pit box. So that's the thing is, so maybe we're onto something here if we just kind of talk through this is, from a matchup perspective, maybe we're looking at guys that qualify well, but from an outright perspective, maybe take some guys that are a little longer priced, maybe say upwards of 15 to 20 to 1, and hope you can hit a bomb and protect yourself with some guys that are just going to be running up front all day long when it comes to matchups. I think that's actually, as I think about this and we have this conversation, I do think that might be a good recipe for a solid race card where you have a chance to hit a bomb, or just a solid outright price while still being profitable if you just kind of go 3-0 or 4-0 in matchups, which could happen.
Before we close the book on, some of the other drivers that we're looking at as we trend to tier 3, we can start with Ross Chastain, who did well by us last week. And of course, our listeners for the race day best bet, getting the best of Joey Logano in that head-to-head matchup. When we look at Chastain, I mean, he had his first top 10 finish in Coda at Charlotte, a span of 8 races, 1 top 5 this season, still seeking his first trip to the podium. When we look at Gateway, finished 8th here in 2022, outside the top 20 in 2023, but 5th in total speed ranking in the last 2 races, yet to lead a lap in 2 trips. I mean, Ross Chastain, Alex Bowman, Bubba Wallace, anybody else that we haven't discussed yet that you wanted to highlight before we kind of close the book on some of the driver previews?
Yeah, I think Ross, he was my pick to win after practice and qualifying last year. A little bit disappointed in the speed in the race car. I like Chastain at this track for one reason and one reason only. It's you have to be aggressive. No one's just going to give you the spot. Everyone knows that it's easier to just take 2 tires or steal track position and hang on versus drive through the field. So that is why I do like Ross Chastain typically at this track. He hasn't qualified that well here. I think he's right around an average of like a 9th place starting spot, which isn't terrible for him. I actually do like his teammate a little bit more in Daniel Suarez. I think, gosh, you could probably find him. I'm looking right now at a book that doesn't sponsor the show, so I'm not going to give him a shout out, but he's 100 to 1 here. And he's a guy that's tough to pass. And if there's someone that's going to take a chance, remember, he's got a win banked from earlier this year. And I think that this is a track where Daniel Suarez has been quite comfortable. He's a guy that I think maybe a little bit of upside when it comes to betting him. Maybe there's a top 10 price on him that you could find, but he ran really solid here last year. Haven't seen a ton of speed out of him recently, but he did look good last week. And I think that they should carry over some of that momentum from last week's race. Bubba, this is not a Bubba track for me. The Bubba Wallace, the price at 40 to 1, if he qualifies well, yeah, I think that's a great price, but he just hasn't had that same qualifying that he had in 2023, where he was kind of week in and week out making his way into that top 10. So I think that's about it. Josh Berry, gosh, I want to back him. He's kind of an 80 to 1 guy. Intermediate package, shorter track, a little bit of momentum, but I just can't get behind SHR at this point. It's kind of a wait and see. So, I don't know. Does that answer your question as far as these later tier guys?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's always interesting. We know this isn't a sport where it's easy to cash some of those long shot tickets, but there are creative ways to get a little bit of exposure to some of these guys, whether it be in the top 3, top 5, or top 10 market at some of the exorbitant prices, and have to be comfortable going, all right, look, I don't expect this driver to finish in the top 10, but if I make him 3.5 to 1 and the market opens at 6 to 1, I'm willing to take a crumb there and make sure that if he runs well and all things play out the way that you drew him up, can get you paid in that particular instance. Waving the green, white checkered flag on stage 2. You can follow Chris on X at Chris Werme 15, on Todd Fuhrman. Follow me there. And most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Werme, as we get to stage 3, in the wake of what we saw transpire last week, and I always think it's important that we relay to our audience some of the mistakes that we've made when it comes to building a betting card. And we thought it was going to be in our best interest to look to bet against Tyler Reddick with some of the better drivers in the field. Faded him with William Byron. That worked out. Faded him with Denny Hamlin. Faded him with Martin Truex. Those two did not. Reddick, of course, penalized early on, went a lap down, was able to get his lap back. When you look at some of those situations and how you try and balance finding that perceived edge versus what can play out, all based on track, or are there other things that you would impart to some of our listeners who are watching practice? They're keeping their eyes trained on a lot of the NASCAR insiders, trying to glean any small percentage edge that they possibly can.
Well, if you listen to Actions Detrimental, he goes into a long discussion about the pit stalls to the point where I had to kind of skip ahead. But for those of you that are understanding what is so important with these pit stalls, I recommend going to listen to Denny Hamlin's podcast, because it's like 20 minutes where they talk about how important these pit stalls are and how you actually choose a stall and what's a good proper stall. I think that's really important. I've never, up until this race car or this next gen car, I've never looked at a pit stall and thought, oh, that's going to be race ending or that's going to be a problem, until this. And when Denny's talking about the difference between Chris Buescher's stall, who didn't get to pick, and Tyler Reddick's stall, who also didn't get to pick, Tyler Reddick didn't have any issues all day. And you looked at the 42, the 3, the 11, and the 17 had issues all day long on pit road. I think that's one thing that I need to get better at is, hey, is this going to be a problem? And when you look at pit road, you're going to know who's going to be a lead lap car and who isn't. You're going to start to understand who has a clean entry and who has a clean exit. But Denny Hamlin lost spots all day and was pissed at Chris Buescher. Well, he didn't realize that he had the 42 in front of him, and that was only an issue because the 3, in the way that they were racing, is they were all kind of entering at the same time, whereas you had Reddick had a clean in and clean out.
Yeah,
like
makes life a hell of a lot easier.
I saw Reddick clean in and clean out. We should have thought to ourselves, well, he's going to get back on the lead lap. And if you're not losing spots on pit road, he was fast enough to be a top 10 car. Now, he was matched up against really fast race cars that just didn't quite have it, but he was also matched up against a guy, Denny Hamlin, who was just trying not to lose 6 or 7 spots on pit road every single time. So I think that's one thing where I really need to get better about paying attention to pit road, and instead of blindly just fading someone, take that into account, because we didn't have huge positions. It wasn't, going to make or break our race either way. But it was just one of those things where if Reddick, he just never lost spots on pit road. And we spent a lot of time with Denny Hamlin of him just losing spots, regaining positions over these long green flag runs, but then losing 2 or 3 more. They kind of were netting out to just kind of that 3rd or 4th place spot where Denny was running. The other would be the weather.
That's exactly what I wanted to get to. I mean, should we be looking at things where, look, it may not run the full distance, but at the same time, if you're going to try and pretend that you can get inside the weather forecast more effectively than the powers that be for NASCAR and everybody else, then you're also diluting yourself in the grand scheme of it.
Yeah, I think I would like to talk about the weather in terms of live betting. I was able to get some Chris Bell, but if for everyone that was watching the race, you have to make sure that, because I took Chris Bell at a short price and I went a little larger than I normally do from a live betting perspective, because I had to kind of get out of my positions that weren't going to win. Mainly Brad Keselowski, who had a 20-1, 18-1, 16-1. But you have to know there was weather clearly on the way, but there was also a stage and then another caution that kind of came within, a 30 or 40 lap window. And I was hesitant to bet Chris Bell because I wasn't sure how the strategy was going to play out. I did not bet Chris Bell till he got to, I think, plus 350, but that was when they were good on fuel to the end of stage 3, because the last thing you want is to take a short price at like this plus 350 and then have a quick caution after 15 or so laps to where everyone can pit, take tires, and still have a 20 or 30 lap run before the weather hits. So I took a short price on Chris Bell, knowing that they could go the 60 laps to finish stage 3. I didn't know that they'd get there, but the last thing you want is to have different strategies trying to get into the weather. It's the only time I'll take a short price like that is when I know I've heard on the radio, hey, we are not pitting again until it rains or it misses us. And that's when I decided to take a short price on Chris Bell. I think that it means a little bit more to live betting. Really hard to make a prediction pre-race. The only thing I would say is if you're thinking about a bet and you're not quite sure, the answer is always no, especially if you sprinkle in some weather. If the answer is maybe, or you're thinking to bet something, if you sprinkle a little bit of weather in there, that's variance you can't handicap when it's going to happen. I mean, if it comes out, 15 laps sooner, Chris Bell probably still, was leading the race at that point. But if they get that race going again, and here I am sitting on this heavy Chris Bell ticket at a terrible price, I thought Keselowski was better than him. And I certainly would have loved to have seen that 5 car starting tail end of the lead lap with, the fastest car. If Justin Allgaier is running around in 12th in that thing, Kyle Larson has a 3 or 4 second lead. So for me, just to get out of the weekend, I was happy with just the race ending, breaking even, just get me the hell out of there. Rain everywhere, delays everywhere. It could have been a catastrophe, but I waited to take Chris Bell at a short price when I knew he was not going to pit until the stage ended. And once everyone was on that, on that schedule, that pit schedule, I was happy to take a shorter price.
It's one of those elements that you don't oftentimes incorporate into all your handicapping, but I think the live component of it is fascinating to think about. And for those folks who find themselves locked into the races, watching them in their entirety, there are all sorts of different angles and aspects that you can take advantage of, especially with more and more books offering live betting now than would have 5, 7, 10 years ago to be able to add those to your portfolio, which leads us, speaking of portfolios, to the best bet portion of the program. And, last week we weren't able to get there. Chris Buescher ends up going from right around a pick'em when we gave it out on the show, flipping to a short underdog. Did take money in that head-to-head matchup, though, opened around plus 125, closed at even money. And who knows, if that race plays out in its entirety, maybe he has a chance to catch Christopher Bell. We'll never know. Either way, it doesn't get us to the window. But in terms of this week, when you start to look at some of the pre-week prices at Gateway, have you identified an opportunity for us to get our money in good?
Yeah, there's this will be a top 10 bet that I think should be more in like the 2-1 range, that is sitting at 8-1 on FanDuel. And that is Michael McDowell to finish in the top 10. 8-1 at FanDuel. I like it all the way down to 6-1, where I think that's sitting at DraftKings. Here's why I like it. If you look at the average finishes for just the Cup Series, looking at this race in 2022 and 2023, you see that Austin Cindric has the 7th best finish. AJ Allmendinger has the 8th best finish on average. Chris Buescher, 9th. And then in 12th, you have Michael McDowell. Now, McDowell had some issues, but what do those drivers have in common? They are all great road course racers.
Yep.
Austin Cindric especially, same with AJ Allmendinger. It's because of the amount of shifting that they do at this track relative to all the other tracks. And when you're shifting 2 or 3 times 2 times in every corner, you're going to, the guys that are used to that shifting are going to have an advantage. And we've seen it with road course racers running really well at this track. I anticipate more of the same. Michael McDowell, we saw him. I know that it's a different track than Phoenix, but it's the same tires. Obviously, it's a different track than Phoenix. It's a different package than Phoenix, but the same tire. And we saw him get a top 10 finish. So far at this track, he hasn't qualified particularly well, but he's worked his way to an average finish of 13.5. Last year, he finished 9th, where he was just taking 2 tires constantly and was able to just maintain his track position. Throw in the fact that the Fords have been finding speed, and especially this new relationship that the 34 and 38 have with Ford. I certainly think that Michael McDowell, there's a lot of value on that 8-1 price. Like I said, I like it all the way down to 6-1 as well. But I think he could qualify in the top 10. We could see that price go off at maybe a plus 175 if he does well there on practice qualifying.
Nothing wrong with taking some long shot value that's out there that we don't think will be available once we see the cars unload and where they'll set up on the starting grid. So Michael McDowell top 10 price all the way down into that 6-1 range. Do shop around. As always, we know books are offering a wide array of pricing on the 34 this weekend. Anything else, Wormser, you'd like to share with our loyal listenership before you bid them a fond farewell for another race weekend?
No, I'm just, this is not the most exciting race, in my opinion, but you can make
It'll
money.
happen fast.
It will. Oh, yeah. I think you should definitely tune into the pre-race poll. That'll go 2 hours before it goes green. There are some things that are different about this race that we can take advantage of, and it will happen after practice and qualifying. So certainly a race you should tune in for, but do not expect a ton of passing. I will say that.
Shocking. Any track under a mile and a half in the next gen era, regardless of what they use for engines or tires. Don't expect a lot of passing unless the passing is taking place on pit road. So we'll see if the age-old trend continues this particular weekend. But all right, Worm, we've done enough damage. We're going to close up shop here and let our listeners do their thing. Again, you can follow Chris on social media at ChrisWormy15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there, the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. But most importantly, with a Michael McDowell top 10 ticket in hand come Sunday afternoon, we'll see you at the window.